So we've obviously talked around, but one of the obvious things is we've talked a lot around, yes, we knew about the regulation, not that we've read it, of course, but the big thing is what to expect. That might sound a little bit banal. Obviously, we've seen the regulations. We know there's some standards coming, over 30 of them, but what are we actually expecting? So I'm going to do a quick recap on the Cybersecurity Act. I don't want to do too much of the low-level stuff for obvious reasons. Because, yes, the EU is, one can criticise the EU, but the overriding actual thinking behind it, if you look at the world that we live in today and you look at the kind of warfare that's taking place in both the Middle East and sadly in Western Europe, or more Eastern Europe, then cybersecurity, it really is crucial. So there will always be a discussion about how things are done, but the actual essence, at least the thinking, is clearly well aligned with the world that we sadly now live in. So of course, as those of you are familiar, you'll have done EMC, you'll have done safety, you'll have done RED, you're familiar with the normal kind of things of presumption of conformity. New Act comes out, you take the harmonised standards, you hope they're cited in the OJ, and at that point you can declare conformity, which supports obviously your declaration against that particular directive in the declaration of conformity of the product. You can apply the CE mark. Easy. If only. Now, for those of us who've been around and remember EMC, there's a little bit of a deja vu moment. If you were around in the mid-90s, sadly I was, you'll have probably remembered the graveyard shifts in test labs trying to get things tested because the labs at the time, through no fault of theirs, were having to deal with this massive backlog. So in a way there's a parallel, but it's different. In the days of EMC and safety, you could at least take the product to the lab, make a physical measurement and either say, yes, it passed or no, it didn't. If only cybersecurity were that simple. It's much more of an assessment process. It doesn't involve a spectrum analyzer or a LISN and all those other things that we used to use for EMC. And one of the challenges is there was a hope that there would be more harmonised standards, particularly for the horizontal groups of products. I'll touch on that in a minute. But the challenge is without harmonised standards, obviously the route to conformity and compliance is that much more complicated. The thing to keep in mind is, well, why would I worry about that? But if you're now talking to your C-suite about what that means, this comes with legal teeth. There's some big fines. It's much bigger than RED. So if market assessment picks your product up and decides that it's not compliant, the costs involved for CRA are much, much bigger than any other directive, at least in a product sense. Obviously, we'll ignore some of the bigger things like NIS2 and those kinds of things. So just a quick recap for those people who are in this market. You don't have to worry about CRA. You're probably not even here anyway, but that's another story. So just to recap, medical, civil, particularly sole use, military, obviously they're very much outside of scope. The crucial products that have been identified, we're back to Joe's comment about have you read the CRA. So just to save you if you haven't read the regulation, there is a set of products that have been identified, Class 1 and Class 2, they're known as the important products. And I'm not going to obviously go through the list, those of which have been particularly identified because of the cybersecurity risk that they carry. And we'll come on to why that's important in a minute. You've also got critical products, fairly self-explanatory. They're typically products that are rather crucial, they're either national infrastructure or they're significant roots of trust in products. Just a quick recap. I'm sure you're all aware already, but it is pertinent. We are literally now 2 months or just under 2 months now before the first applicability date, which was the 11th of September. And that's for all the vulnerability and incident reporting. Some of the mechanics of that will get covered in a later presentation. I'm going to do more of the, as it were, the high level overview. And then obviously full applicability is December next year. Oh, that's good, I don't have to worry about it. Okay, I'll come back to that one, if only. So I wanted to provide a bit of an overview, because often when I don't know about anybody else's email inbox, maybe it's just mine, but I see lots and lots and lots of emails telling me, and this is not to take away from those vendors offering me secure boot or a crypto module or a secure micro. And whilst all of those are very good, and they're crucial components to a product cybersecurity, if you will, they're down here. They're this small piece. I mean, it isn't a small piece, obviously, but this is the kind of thing you need for fulfilling requirements. The challenge is, and we're looping back to Joe's point, there's all these other things, a lot of which have a real business context. So the obvious one, which the standards don't address, it wasn't in the standard M606 standardization request, is security incident policy. It's actually in Article 14 of the regulations. So that is pretty much, it's fairly self-explanatory. Obviously that's to do with, as an OEM, there's an active exploitation and you need to be able to handle that. There's some obligations. None of that's covered by the standards. And so that's obviously something businesses need to concern themselves with. You've got the vulnerability disclosure process, CVDs. I'm sure probably most of you in the room, in fact I'm probably fairly certain all of you in the room are familiar with that. But again, that's another process. So as Joe was saying, these are new pieces. Anybody who's worked on Red, this didn't come in because it wasn't product related, it's process related. So the next thing about those is, we've got this nice little convenient box over on the left-hand side, SBOM. Do you actually know what's in your product? Now, I'd love to say, I'm going to make the assumption that certainly all the vendors in this room will know what's in their product, but I would suggest that there's quite a lot of OEMs out there, through no deliberate policy or fault or whatever, aren't necessarily familiar with what's actually in their product. And sometimes that may be as simple as engineers are good at fixing things. They need to find a way to fix something. So the classic example that companies have got caught on, their engineers have decided they need to solve a problem and they've gone to open source. Now that's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. Now, we won't get into the issues around software licensing and which LGPL or GPL2 or whatever, but then there's the question of, under CRA, have you got somebody or an organisation that is going to support that open source software? Because you can't go, and of course there are plenty of examples of open source which is literally supported by one or two individuals. Now it's unreasonable, quite rightly, to expect them to be on the hook to provide commercial support. So now as an OEM, you suddenly find, once you start looking at an SBOM, you might suddenly find there's components in there that you may have to take on the responsibility for the support. So you can start to see where this is going, which is what started out as we thought it was a technical problem. Does your organisation actually have a policy about what software components can even get included in your product? And typically, that becomes that's policy. Similarly, on the vulnerability disclosure, we've got the SBOM now. We've done that bit. We've now got to understand, so what components have we got to monitor, and what, and obviously then there's an assessment process to do with that. We then go into obviously secure update. I think most people are familiar with at least the concepts of that, but it's the fact there's a vulnerability. It's now got to be delivered. So we're back to the example that Joe gave, which is for some companies that could be quite a significant headache because of the size of the population of their product. Once you start talking about updating 1 million boxes in any scale, that's an exercise in itself. But you've then got the challenge in some industrial sectors, those products may not even be connected. There are certainly plenty of production processes where for the production engineers, the idea that their product will be connected to the internet is the stuff of nightmares. Because once they've locked that production line down, they are certainly not going to start allowing people just to go and patch that equipment because they've got a production line to run. So there then comes the other piece, which is the risk assessment, which for a lot of companies, there'll be plenty of people who will have done risk assessment, but not in a cybersecurity context. So you can see already, some of these are not necessarily, there is a technical element, but there's quite a lot of business process in here. And I'll pick up on that a little bit later. There's a few other things. There's then obviously what comes out of the risk assessment. So one of the first things would be, does your product come into the scope of either default class 1, class 2? And what's known as the default class, i.e. you weren't listed on the previous slides, that is what's termed the horizontal scope, if you will. And it's a huge scope. You know, everything from some consumer devices to industrial products. So you've then got to have some way of risk assessing that. Now, I'd love to say to you that the standards were written with a compliance class in the way that the ITSS assurance framework was. Sadly, I can't. That wasn't addressed. So it is left to the OEMs themselves to have to do the risk assessment. Now, keep in mind that you're involved with legal compliance. And if you get it wrong, it costs money. Or, as Hayden and I were discussing this morning, at least for the exec, you'd like to know there's at least some safe harbour in this and some valid defence that's going to defend senior people when having declared that your product is compliant. So really the aim of this was just to flesh out the piece. We often hear the piece around the low-level security requirements, very important. But it's the importance of keeping in idea that there's a lot more to CRA than just as it were the CE mark on the product, because it has organisational implications. So the piece that isn't covered by standards, which is security incident reporting, just a quick recap if you're not familiar with it, and I can't blame you if you haven't read all the legals. 24 hours early warning. Now, just for the sake of clarity, and this question did come up in standard circles, so your OEM salesman's out on a Friday night with a beer with a friendly customer, and the friendly customer says, I think there's a vulnerability. Well, certainly current understanding in standard circles, that's not a formal notification. So an organisation isn't to be expected to have extracted that information from the salesman on Monday morning and have got the notification out. But the point is still crucial. Within 24 hours of a formal notification of a potential vulnerability, that has to be reported to the European CCERT and ENISA. Now, obviously, this is an active vulnerability, it's an incident. So it's not just a theoretical, I think I might have hacked something. It's the possibility that the product or products or system has been hacked. This piece is still, I'm still reading this bit and figuring it out, but certainly in terms of 72 hours, further details has to be provided to CCERT. There's then the question mark of either within a month or within 14 days of the final report based on the back of the mitigation being released, or at least an upgrade. And that's one I think that does need a little bit more work. But again, that's a conversation we're having in standard circles. How that then works for OEMs who've never seen this before, it just illustrates the kind of challenge that Joe has already started to set the scene for. And this, as Joe was saying, is where the IATSS has been doing this for 10 years. Release 1 was November 2016. So it is literally coming up for 10 years ago. And these are the kind of challenges. Do we really expect every single OEM to have to go away and figure it out for himself? That doesn't sound like a particularly good use of time. Vulnerability handling. Now, obviously, this is just to be clear. This isn't an incident. This is the classic monitoring your product, the CVEs for the components that you've introduced, and obviously also dealing with any, for example, a researcher coming in and talking to your organisation and informing of a potential vulnerability. So the crucial thing is it hasn't happened, but it's a potential vulnerability. So obviously we've got the classic one of now we're into supply chain. We've gone back to that S1 piece. We need to be monitoring the components, not just our own product, because it might be that, if you will, you've almost got two funnels in a business. You've got the front funnel, which is a security researcher has done some research on your product and hopefully is disclosing it to you privately before they've made it public. That's one instance, but obviously you've also got what may come in effect through the supply chain. You've introduced a radio module or a component or some other element, software element. You need to be monitoring as an organisation the vulnerabilities that go with those components. So it's again, we're back to the business. How are we arranged for that? And not only that, obviously in the supply chain case, we've been advised of a vulnerability. What are the fix arrangements? I mean, there's even the basic thing of, is cybersecurity patching included in our supply chain on that cellular module that we integrate in our product, for example? So moving on to routes to compliance, we touched upon that earlier, the whole piece about the traditional method. I take a harmonised standard that's relevant to the directive I'm trying to comply with. I check it's cited in the OJ, and I would do the relevant tests or assessments against that standard to be able to declare compliance with that particular directive. The thing to keep in mind is, in the case of CRA, is the first thing is the default class doesn't have to be third-party assessed. And the other thing, keep a note of this one, obviously normally if there were harmonised standards in the OJ, that's the classic route. You go and do the tests and you make the declaration because you have what's called a presumption of conformity. But if you actually look at the standards that are coming through, principally the main one that's likely to be harmonised will be vulnerability disclosure. But in the horizontal case, and I stress the horizontal case, that it's unlikely that the other standards will be harmonised, and they've still got to be cited. We'll come on to when they're available in a minute. So for the default class, for all of you not on those earlier lists, you could either go with a harmonised standard if it exists. The other thing to keep in mind is you can make a direct compliance statement against the regulation. And it's perfectly permissible to do that and, for example, to use a framework to do that. So you don't have to use a standard. In the case of Class 2 and crucial products, obviously it's different. You have to be third-party assessed. So that means going to a TUV or an element for assessment. And at that point, obviously, then there's a conversation about what standards you might use. And that, of course, may even involve a notified body as to which standards might be applicable. But if we look at the default class, that's classic Pareto. That's probably at least 80% of the market. That at the moment will have probably unlikely to have the skills in-house to be able to immediately pick that up and say, yes, I know how to declare compliance. So just a quick recap on the standards. There's something in excess of 30 standards in development at the moment, which if you're familiar with
standards for most directives, that's pretty much unprecedented. It's a huge amount of work. I mean, for those involved with RED and EN 18031, which was ultimately 3 standards, but it was written as one draft, and then the various subsets pulled out for the asset type, be it network, personal or financial. In the case of CRA, you've got 4 standards for horizontals, and you've got something like at least 20, I can't remember the last count, it's getting on for 30 verticals. So you can imagine that's, I think I'm being diplomatic here, that's actually put quite a stress both on CENELEC and actually to produce standards in what in standards terms is probably breakneck speed. I mean, you don't normally expect to develop harmonised standards in a couple of years. So my main focus for this morning, because verticals is a whole another ball game, but if we come back to the Pareto piece, that for 80% of OEMs, they're going to fall into the horizontals. You've still got to look at a number of standards. Were they ready? Come to that in a minute. But the one thing, at least for OEMs who haven't seen the standards yet, EN 18031 is probably a good place to start. It'll give you a fairly good idea of what's coming. And that actually took some encouragement. There were some in standard circles who felt that perhaps it could be done differently. But there were a number of OEMs who, having already been through that, have said, why would you want to change it? If we've already done the hard work, why would we go and do something completely different? So a quick recap on the planned timeline. We won't worry about the regulation, that bit's gone. But the first thing to say is July 2026, i.e. this month, the plan was that notified bodies would have been appointed. 30th of August, the vulnerability standard would have been available. Bearing in mind that the following month, if you remember the applicability piece, the 11th of September, you basically got 2 weeks to read the standard and be compliant. I will make no further comment because I think that would be inappropriate. I should at this point explain, I am an expert on the BSI expert group. I don't work for a BSI, so that's not a formal position, by the way. The vertical standards from ETSI are due at the end of October, and obviously next year is the final date that products have to be compliant. Just keep those in mind. As I said earlier, I'm going to cover largely the horizontal standards. So we've got everything from vocabulary, we've got effectively the risk assessment, the principal standard, a set of generic security requirements, otherwise known as the requirements catalogue, the risk assessment then helping manufacturers decide which requirements are applicable to their product. So unfortunately, as I think Paul and I were having the conversation this morning, sadly those nice convenient flowcharts in 18031 have gone. It is now a case of you have to look through your risk assessment to decide which requirements are going to be applicable. You've obviously then got the vulnerability standard. That's one certainly that's intended to be harmonised, but obviously it would need to be cited for presumption of conformity. And obviously that covers the vulnerability handling. So just to be clear, that's handling, i.e. notifications either from the front, through the front of the business, researchers, or through the supply chain, not incident. Doesn't cover security incidents. So here we are, the current timeline. So at the moment, the thing to remember is that the first one out will be the principles, now in October. So the risk assessment is not planned to be published till October. The vertical standards which are in development, they're not due till the end of the year. There's some debate at the moment on vulnerability handling. Officially it's scheduled for October, but there's some question mark over that. So that date is subject to confirmation, but there's a risk it'll slip. And then obviously we've got
Generic requirements, again, October 2027. Which, again, if you're building a hardware product, the idea that the requirements you're going to build it to 2 months later you're going to be compliant is probably a bit of an ask. I mean, I know there are some companies now that can turn hardware at sub 9 months, but I would imagine for most companies, and certainly anybody in the industrial sector, the idea you're going to spin a hardware product in under 12 months is probably an ask.
And get it assessed.
And get it assessed. Well, in fact, the argument might be it could take 2 months just to do the assessment. Joe's made the point, I think, very clearly this morning. This is a business problem. And this is just really just a quick recap. Why it's no longer a case of give engineering the standards and they'll come back and make it comply. So we've already talked about, as it were, the back end and the front end of the business. So things like researchers. So are there contact points that researchers can come and talk to the business? But you've heard us talk also about supply chain. So suddenly now we've got to involve procurement. Do we have, in the first instance, the right communication channels in those procurement relationships to actually know what it is we need to monitor? The next question is, have we got agreements around how long that product is going to receive security patches? No, I didn't say feature upgrades, 2 different things. Because from a procurement point of view, if you're now planning a new product, that component, or that, let's take the cellular module, it's the classic example. How long is that cellular module not only going to be available from a physical point of view, procurement placed the order, 10,000 modules come in, but how long after, when the manufacturer's issued a last time buy or an EOL, how long are they going to carry on patching that product in the event of a security patch? So that's one area. Then obviously you've got, the supply chain support. How do those updates come through? How do they get built? How do they get integrated? Another big area, key management. I would guess that I would hazard an assertion that there's quite a lot of production facilities don't have the concept at the moment of how do you securely deploy security credentials into your product. Now, in my case, having had a background in set-top boxes where the media companies are absolutely paranoid, for good reason, obviously of content being stolen, it's always been quite usual that was typically anchored with a SIM card or some other piece of security, and it was a given that there was a secure part of the factory where those credentials were programmed and blown in. And I'm sure a number of you might have heard, for example, Apple is a good example. They have their own facility inside Foxconn for doing that work. They take ownership of it. Now, for a lot of manufacturers, that's a challenge. How many companies today actually manufacture in-house? I would argue very few. Most of them are relying on a contract manufacturer. So then they're in parts of the world that may be remote, where they're in different legal jurisdictions. So that in itself is a whole piece of not only legal, but may even be a whole piece of engineering. How do you build your product securely and ensure? We're all familiar with the classic example of certain parts of the world. Yes, I know how many product came out the front door of the factory, but how many come out the back? And then you wind in that you've now got to deploy credentials in that kind of supply chain. I hasten to add it can be done. We've done to an extent vulnerability. The other questions, just simply organisational cybersecurity. Does the in some cases, I think we will see, because I've certainly seen companies who said they've been asked by their customer, do you comply with NIS2, for example, or NIS? And the answer being, well, we're a product company, we don't directly get involved with infrastructure. But one of the things I think is a direction of travel as more of these kind of directives, particularly to anybody involved in the infrastructure sector, will be the expectation, not only is your product secure, but is your organisation secure?
So that hopefully just gives some steer on CRA and its implications is a lot more than just give it to engineering. Quick recap, one of the crucial things about the notified bodies was the old one. I think I may have got them the wrong way around. Oh, yes, I have. Okay, my apologies. I had a feeling that this one hadn't made it. So just a quick recap, July 2026, the EU was expecting notified bodies to be appointed. Certainly at least as of today, as far as we know, there aren't any notified bodies have been appointed. Bear in mind, obviously, they would have to be EU based. I'm kind of looking hopefully at Joe and Mustinir at this point, but I don't think we're not aware of any notified bodies. Just for the purpose of the video, Mustinir's fiercely shaking his head. Thanks, Mustinir. So why is that significant? So we talked a little bit earlier about harmonised standards, but if the standards that you want to use either aren't harmonised or may not be quite the right fit for your product and you have to start looking for other standards, then normally you'd go to a notified body to be able to get an opinion as to what standards might be appropriate. You can kind of see the challenge then. So for OEMs right now, if there's no notified bodies and the standards aren't out, how do I put this together? Obviously, the other thing we touched on earlier is the standards are late. Vulnerability should have been October, probably towards the end of the year. So, just to add to it, we've got the obligation to report as OEMs to the CCERT, European CCERT and EUVD platform. Just for a heads up, that's in trial right now. So with no confirmed publication dates for either the harmonisation of the standards, not when the standards are just published, and also the OJ, you can kind of start to see that for most of the OEMs, A, do you understand the problem? But if you understand the problem, what's the fix? If you don't actually know what you're trying to comply with. On a practical point, 18031, as we said earlier, will at least help you with the product elements, but what it doesn't do particularly well is deal with what do I do for the vulnerability disclosure, what do I do for the security incident. And as Joe was making a very eloquent case, we'll pick this up later in more detail, but the IATSF's been writing requirements and getting its head around requirements and vulnerability disclosure and was doing it 10 years ago. There's a big body of knowledge in the IATSF for this. And the benefit the IATSF has, it comes far more from an industrial and OEM type stance, as it were, rather than purely a standards-based one. Because for most OEMs, we don't want subjective requirements. We simply want one that says, there's some way of reading the requirement and there's a fairly clear outcome. Either I pass or I fail, one or the other. Not something that leaves a lot of interpretation, because in the event that one is now in a court with market assessment, the worst thing for an OEM is having a requirement that is open to a subjective interpretation, because at that point you're in the hands of the lawyers, and needless to say, the likelihood is the lawyers will have different views. So that's as much, and I say this not to take away from the very hard work that's been put in by the standards group, and it is an awful lot of work. I mean, just to give you an idea, historically standards groups used to meet monthly, bi-monthly. To give you an idea, some of these standards meetings, there's literally sometimes 3 meetings a week. which is almost unheard of in standard circles. So I don't want anybody to walk away with the impression that there wasn't an awful lot of hard work going on. There is. There really is. And there's some really very, very well-intended people putting in massive amounts of effort. But unfortunately, from an OEM point of view, we need to help industry in terms of how do you achieve compliance. And as I've slightly indicated, if you're in the horizontal category, that may, at least in the short term, that may, with IATSF support or other frameworks, you simply do a declaration against the direct regulation. So I hope you found that informative, and I will pass you back to Chris. Thank you very much.